Now, don't get me wrong. I know they're all a bunch, every single one of them are wankers. I know that. Okay? I also know that you'll get diddly squat back from them. But why I do this is because I get a great deal of fun out of it. One, I get to tell them, you might think we're all thick as shit, but we're not. And two, I get it put on record that they've been advised. And I like that.
Nothing would make me less likely to go shopping than the thought of having to mask up. Was this consultation with the police force, and particularly the Chief Constable of Hampshire? For it is she that will have to enforce this monstrous imposition against myself and a number of outraged and reluctant constituents.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the balance in the need to restrict the spread of the virus, whilst also allowing the ancient liberties of a gentleman to go shopping, is a difficult balance to strike. And we have made the judgment that the best way to strike it is to allow a gentleman to go shopping, but require him to wear a face mask. And of course, the enforcement is for the police, but the enforcement is, I think, will largely be undertaken by the British people themselves, who have been remarkable in their fortitude at sticking with these rules, even whilst they may be a frustrating imposition.
To what extent is there a possibility that it is the exponential increase in testing itself, in identifying genuine new cases, and the very significant possibility of false positives that is giving a distorted impression of the trajectory of the disease?
Well, I like my right honourable friend very much, and I wish it were true. The reason that we have the surveillance testing done by the Office for National Statistics is to ensure that we're constantly looking on a national representative sample at what the case rate is, as well as, of course, using the tests. And as we increase the testing numbers, inevitably we'll find more of the cases that are there. That ONS survey published on Friday does show a rise in the numbers, consummate with the rise in the numbers of tests that have come back positive, and that does take into account this point about false positives, which is a very important one.
Is there no scintilla of doubt in his mind, occasioned by the growing body of scientific opinion, which questions the interpretation of the data and concludes that the policies of governments, I use the plural, the policies of governments are having an impact worse than the disease itself?
I'm afraid to say I would love my right honourable friend to be right, but I firmly believe, not only based on the clinical advice, but also based on my own analysis of and judgment of the facts and the international comparisons, that it is necessary for the public health of the nation to take actions to control the spread of the disease, and to take the firm and now legislative actions that we are. And the reason is that if the virus spreads, we know that it then spreads into the older age group who too often die from this disease. And we also know that it doesn't just go up in a straight line. If you let this disease rip, it goes up exponentially. And that's why, with a heavy heart, I strongly support the extra measures that the Prime Minister outlined yesterday, and the strategy of this government and of most governments around the world to handle this pandemic.
Now, there is a principle in international law, and it is this, that no country can be bound by an obligation that it made when that obligation is interpreted in such a way as to undermine the very integrity of that country. That is a principle of international law.
Dear Mr. Swain, I am not your constituent, and therefore, as is so well managed and controlled by the British government, you shall have to refuse replying to me in any form other than to apologise for not replying. I find this such a strange policy, given that if I were to meet you in the street, or if you were on national TV, where what you say is broadcast to everyone, you could, in fact, communicate with me. However, to my point on your question, and I am 100% positive there are people in our national and local governments who are well aware of what is going on with this COVID-19 crisis. While it was an excellent question in of itself, and had Mr. Hancock in what was quite clearly a state of shock, it didn't go far enough. If you would indulge me for a moment, the United Nations has taken advantage of the continual devolution of powers to local governments and city mayors. In doing so, they've also created a global mayors covenant, C40 cities, and various other climate change focus organisations, NGOs, public-private partnerships, foundations, charities, etc., and invested billions globally into this. The goal was to create and implement a 2020 deadline to start significantly impacting carbon emissions globally. National government targets were not considered enough in targeting carbon neutral for 2050. And the UN and their collaborators set up a climate alliance to tackle the issue a number of years ago. The World Economic Forum, including support from Prince Philip, Prince Charles and Prince William, set a target for a global Great Reset to usher in a fourth industrial revolution. The target year for this to commence being 2020. Every box is ticked by COVID-19 as the catalyst for all of these previously planned changes in transportation, people's diets, construction, home working, etc. I'm afraid that if anyone considers all of this a coincidence, then they need a very quick and in-depth education. Yes, I am saying COVID is a total fraud. I am also saying it has acted as a Trojan horse to justify the control policies which we are currently experiencing. You may say, how do you think the UK government could create 40,000 plus COVID deaths and other governments create theirs? Very easily. You know as I do that a proven and significant number of these deaths were not of COVID at all, but due to other underlying issues these mostly elderly patients had. However, I would also point out the following article. It would be easy to find 40,000 deaths from 130,000 each year. Also, the focus on cases now, because they are turning our focus toward the youth as asymptomatic carriers. We all know our youth generally just don't fall ill and die of underlying causes, so they cannot point to deaths among the young, only cases. Meanwhile, the PCR testing is well known to be ineffective and return false positives, as you say. And the man who invented the test, Kary Mullis, a Nobel Prize winner, stated that such a tool should not be used for the purpose it is now being used for. I have within the foregoing simply given you facts. If you should require further evidences regarding the UN Climate Alliance devolved government powers issue, I'd be more than happy to provide. I doubt, however, I shall hear back from you. Kind regards. The response from Desmond being just as I anticipated. Thanks, DS. So I reply, you're welcome. And that was my first email to Desmond, called Your Question to Matt Hancock Regarding False Positives. And it was to his Parliament UK email. So the second email, as a follow-up I send him, I thought I'll send it to his personal account because perhaps, just perhaps, he may be able to say more. So that was titled Undermine the Very Integrity of That Country, which he mentions. Dear Mr. Swain, perhaps communicating with a personal email address, therefore in your personal capacity, is treated differently from your address in a parliamentary capacity. Undermining, as in the subject line. Back to the COVID/climate change issue and the Covenant of Mayors. I assume you are aware of the securitization of a threat, Mr. Swain. First postulated by the Copenhagen School and since used across a number of areas where it is only necessary for a speech act to give it form and substance, and that it doesn't matter whether the threat is real and tangible or not. Three things which are closely related have been securitized over the course of time since the 1970s. Population growth, climate change, and COVID-19. What happens when an issue is securitized? It is elevated above politics and can, therefore, be used to implement policies which would never have been possible to have been justified within the normal course of democratized politics. Your comments regarding the undermining of a nation's sovereignty, because that is what it comes down to, have ignored or dismissed devolution. The UK government, like many, have been devolving powers to many regions of the UK and continues to do so. It is ostensibly sold to the population as having democratic powers closer to home. However, here's the issue. The United Nations and their collaborators are capitalising on this and implementing policy, that being Agenda 21-2030, which is now being quoted in many local government documents. Directly with these newly devolved cities and regions. This is undermining the very integrity of the United Kingdom. Enter once more the UN and the Secretary General's remarks at C40 World Mayors Summit. Look at the fine detail these people are working on and making sure that the cities and regions work toward greater powers and lean on other stakeholders to ensure they achieve them. City management and powers. If you also study the C40 list of cities and the Global Covenant of Mayors, Cities and Regions, you will see a strong correlation between the cities, regions hit hardest in various ways by COVID-19 and where they lie in terms of commitment within the Climate Alliance goals they have signed up to. Now, while I'm writing this, I'm also thinking that I would be very surprised if you are not already aware of this. But if not, then now you are. If you are already aware, then this communication serves to have you aware that some of the electorate are also aware. Considering your concern for the integrity of this nation, I wonder what your thoughts and perhaps actions may be regarding this. You're fully aware of the war between nationalism and globalization. I would be interested to know which side you're on. As you can see, globalization is doing an excellent job, extremely stealthily, in the destabilizing both the UK and the US national sovereignty. The securitization of COVID, acting as a climate change catalyst, is the perfect Trojan horse. I'll leave you with this, although there are multiple examples. How about this for prescience? Shock to citizens may be needed as climate change fight fails, Deutsche Bank says. Would you convert to plant-based diet to stop climate change? Have one fewer child? And that was the 13th of January 2020, long before COVID ever hit the beaches. You see, while there has been the drive to securitize population growth and climate change over decades, they've failed, with climate change, to achieve the goals. They needed a catalyst, and that was the securitization of a disease, which, for a few years, the World Health Organization and World Economic Forum were referring to as Disease X. It hadn't been decided upon and given a name. Somewhere between the beginning of 2019 and December 2019, it was given its name. Climate change was always too far off in the distance, and the climate wasn't playing ball. It never does when computer models are fake. What was needed was something far more immediate. Voila, COVID. Now, what are we going to do about this little issue, Mr. Swain? People have been put out of work. People are committing suicide, and mental health issues are skyrocketing. People can't put food on their tables, etc. All of this caused by a complete and utter fraud, while a man in number 10 tries to tell the electorate he cares about them. Two things regarding the man at number 10. One, Boris Johnson, global overpopulation is the real issue. Two, BJ's father. And the real problem is humanity itself. You may well be good friends with these two gentlemen. Of course, being a Tory. I personally side with no political camp. Politics is for the ignorant, in my view. A nice little box of red or blue. You can certainly make a good living out of it, however, but the people playing this game of chess will eat you and yours at the end of the day, just as much as they'll eat the rest of us. For the moment, party politics is useful to them, however. They enjoy the work of both useless eaters and useful idiots. Which one are you, and which one am I? Regards. His response again, thanks, I'll reflect on it, DS. So then to David Davis, and this was to his Parliament UK email. Dear Mr. Davis, I am not a constituent of yours, but as you will be aware, one's own MP does not necessarily represent one's wishes, or even would be willing to take on board what one may wish to impart to them. I have, however, noticed your, and perhaps one or two others, views on various issues over a period of time, and I hope not mistakenly, view you as someone who is neither purely a partisan MP or one who refuses to consider that there may be more to an issue than meets the eye. Mr. Davis, just for background, I have a degree in physics and also business. I'm in my late 50s and I've worked for many well-respected multinational companies in the telecoms and defence industries. I have a vast amount of experience dealing at quite high levels globally and have lived overseas in expat positions for over a decade, although have now been back in the UK for the same length of time. I would ask you then, please, not to dismiss what I'm about to say. COVID-19 is not what it says on the tin. COVID-19 is a climate catalyst and is the most recent push and most recent computer model in the aim to introduce both the UN's Agenda 21 and sustainability objectives. It is a fabricated fraud which builds on an original computer model first launched in 1971 by the Club of Rome and MIT, followed up by the climate change hockey stick model from the late 80s onwards to today. Each of these models and the false data they provided were then pushed politically and given security status by a process known as securitization, Copenhagen School. The correlation between those mayors and governors across the world, primarily in Western nations or the global north, and the impact of COVID-19 is highly significant and can be traced to the UN, the C40 cities, Michael Bloomberg, and the Global Covenant of Mayors. The practice of speech acts by political figures attempting to achieve securitization of the three elements, population growth, climate, and disease, specifically COVID-19, has led to the ability to elevate these issues from the political norm to issues of national security. It is not necessary for the referent object, in this case COVID-19, to be an actual physical threat for it to be securitized. The act of securitization then allows for extreme emergency policies and measures to be placed on the population, and this allows for basic rights to be suspended and most often never given back. This is a well-established process, and we saw it with the Patriot Act in the US after 9/11. The process of devolution of cities and regions, ostensibly for the purpose of bringing democracy and decision-making closer to the people in the cities and regions, has allowed for the UN to then influence and incentivize the mayors and governors to enact policy in keeping with the sustainability goals. Ironically then, the decision-making is even further from the locality than Westminster. And it is Westminster devolving such powers which is enabling it. It is transparent to anyone who studies this that COVID-19 is, in fact, a method to instill behaviour across the public, as well as business and industry, which catalyses the process toward meeting SDG targets regarding pollution and carbon emissions. It is well documented that 2020 was an important milestone to bend the curve or we may say flatten the curve. Climate change was not working since business and individuals did not fully get on board with the threat, because while the fear attempted to be induced, people did not see the predictions happening, and they haven't and never will. The issue always seemed to be in the future. It was necessary then to introduce something more immediate, hence COVID-19. I would be happy to share any further information with you regarding this if you care to consider it. For now, I will leave you with just one link related to a document prepared by Deutsche Bank and was reported on the 13th of January this year. The document itself was probably prepared and written in late 2019. KarmaImpact.com. Shock to citizens may be needed as climate change fight fails, Deutsche Bank says. What shock could they have possibly had in mind, Mr. Davis? I would appreciate your considered feedback on this. Yours sincerely. P.S. Leicester and Greater Manchester lockdowns, although the entire UK proclaimed a climate emergency either last year or during 2018. Both cities are significant ones, along with London, on the list of top C40 cities around the world due to their commitments on tackling pollution and reaching SDGs. This is not a coincidence. I myself even predicted Greater Manchester as being next. This can be verified.
The COVID pandemic has been an immense psychic shock to the human race. Global fears have been intensified by the immediacy of round-the-clock news and social media. But we sometimes forget, we face a virus, a small package of nucleic acid that simply replicates. It's not even technically alive. Tragic as its consequences have been, it has been nothing like as destructive as other plagues, let alone the influenza of a century ago. And it's absurd in many ways, outrageous, that this microscopic enemy should have routed the unity of the human race. COVID has caused us to cease other vital work, and I'm afraid it made individual nations seem selfish and divided.
In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war and the threat of war?